Miracles on Maple Hill, Chapter 9, A Big Decision. The summer world grew and swelled and ripened. Weeds along the edges of the fields and in the rail fence corners were up to Marley's waist. By the 4th of July, they were beginning to go brown, and Daddy warned Joe and Marley not to toss their sparkler wires too far with the wires hot. Now, sparklers are those fireworks that come in the box. You light the end of them, and it just shoots sparks. We oftentimes will write our names with those sparklers things. But Dad was telling them not to throw them into the brown weeds because they were dry. And that hot stick and those dry weeds would start a... What do y'all think? So, at the celebration in town, ice cream dripped before you could get your cone licked even once around. That was really summer. Summer, Mr. Chris said that night after the fireworks were over, and they were all having homemade ice cream on his front porch, is fruit time mostly, just the way spring is mostly flower time. Marley could see that it was true. For the rest of the summer, it seemed to get truer and truer. Every flower that had bloomed bore some kind of seed or fruit, and it was a surprise to see how the different ones turned out. For instance, the greeny-looking Clintonia flower bells became beautiful blueberries. But there were so few of those you could search the whole woods and not find enough to string a bracelet. Rose hips were everywhere, yellow and red, and you could make strings of beads clear to your toes without stirring off the porch. Lily of the valley bore clusters of the brightest red, but the false lily of the valley in the woods had berries that were speckled with brown. Solomon's seal had dark blueberries in a neat row where the flowers had hung under the leaves. It was as if all its little bells had run away and forgotten their clappers. The large pale flowers of the May apple had dropped their petals, and their middles swelled bigger and bigger. Chrissy said she'd pay a good price for a basket to make preserves, but it was hard to find so much as a pintful on account of the animals liking them so well. Where trillium had spread its wide white petals, there were now long beads of berries, some red and some black. Twisted stalk had baubles, little transparent red berries you could see into. Now, a bauble is oftentimes referred to as like a trinket or glass beads. Oftentimes, women's jewelry is referred to as baubles when it's not real diamonds, but when it's costume jewelry, sometimes those are referred to as baubles. Let's get back to reading. Mr. Chris said Dutchman's breeches had such bad fruit for cows I'm going to start over. I'm so sorry. Mr. Chris said Dutchman's breeches had such bad fruit for cows to eat that their summer name was Little Blue Staggers. I don't know what Little Blue Staggers has to do with them eating those berries being bad for cows, unless it made the cows stagger. Joe and Marley did so much berrying, what with strawberries and then red raspberries and then blackberries, that Joe said he was absolutely berried out. But they kept going. Fritz showed them such special blackberry patches that they could fill a quart without taking a single step, and each berry was the size of Mr. Chris's thumb. Every time, too, there was apt to be pie afterwards. And with blueberries or huckleberries, there might be pie and then muffins for breakfast besides, and maybe pudding for lunch. I don't know, I might pick berries too. For a while, chokeberries were thick on the trees along the lumber roads that had been a mist of white blooms earlier. They meant jelly. So did elderberries. Later. Eat, eat, eat. Not only the wild things, but all the things in Daddy's garden got ready for eating about the same time, until Mother said she felt food running out of her ears. She canned and juiced and sent lots of things to a freezer so they could be used on weekends during winter visits. I feel like Joseph in Egypt getting ready for the lean years during the fat years, she said. Now, that is referring to a Bible story. Joseph was the boy whose father made him the coat of many colors. And his brothers didn't like him. They were jealous of him. And they threw him into a pit and sold him to a caravan that was passing by. And the caravan took him into Egypt. And he found favor with the folks in Egypt, and he became the overseer for the Pharaoh. And he had a dream. He could interpret dreams. He had a dream that they were going to have 7 years of plenty, and then they were going to have 7 years of famine. Now, famine is where there's not enough food. So what the dream was telling them is during these 7 years of plenty, they needed to put stuff up into their storehouses so that when they did have a famine, they would have excess from the 7 good years that they could eat off of during the 7 lean years. Lean means little or thin, when food is thin. Okay? And so Mama was saying she felt like Joseph. She had put up so much food for the winter and for the next years that she just felt like that they may have been planning for a famine. So let's read on. In August, Marley found the oddest berry she had ever seen. Mr. Chris had warned her never to eat strangers, so she carried a big spray of these to ask him about. Now, what he meant by never eat strangers is don't eat something you don't know what it is, because there were a lot of poisonous things in the woods, and he certainly didn't want Marley to get sick. Let me get back to where I was. Each berry sat on a cunning scarlet flower, which was left behind when the berry was picked away. Pokeberries, Mr. Chris said. Are they ready already? We always made ink out of them for school. He said she could taste them if she wanted to, and of course she did, once. But she'd as soon drink ink for breakfast. When Mother saw them, she laughed and said, Grandma called them ink berries. She was always sorry to see them starting to ripen. They were a sign it was almost time for us to go home again, back to school. Marley gathered a whole lot of them and made a little dish of ink. Mother said she had never in her life seen such a big fuss over such little juice. A whole summer of jellying and juicing, she said, had made so much mess in the kitchen. Purple stains were absolutely everywhere, on the ceiling and even in the drawers that had been a little open. But there was enough in the dish, finally, to write almost a half page of a letter to Carol. Imagine a pokeberry letter, Marley said. That's as nice as strawberry bouquets. The carpets of wintergreen began to show berries, and Mr. Chris said they did not stop growing all winter long. Lost people have been known to brush away the snow and eat those berries to save their lives, he said. The thick green leaves tasted just like chewing gum. Chrissy served for dessert one night what she said was the best berry combination in the whole world, wintergreen berries and blueberries. Marley didn't say so, but raspberries and currants seemed better to her. The creatures in the drying pond sang louder every night. The creatures in the grass and in the fields sang louder every day. Mr. Chris said they knew winter was coming soon and they had to get all the noise out of their systems. Then a few leaves drifted down. Winged seeds lay beneath the tulip trees, and all along the roads milkweed pods began to spill white silky threads. The days seemed to go faster and faster. Mr. Chris looked sad. One night he looked up at the sky and said in the saddest voice Marley had ever heard from him, "When the moon comes full again, there'll be a killing frost." Now, a killing frost is when the frost is, when the temperatures drop to freezing, and it kills anything that was growing. Okay? Chrissy looked sad too. "I wish you could see the leaves turn, Lee," she said again and again. "After you go, I won't be able to stand looking in this direction at night. It's been so good to have somebody in this house watching for the light in the evening just the way I did when your grandma was here." 3 weeks, then 2 weeks until time for school. It seemed odd to Marley how sudden it seemed after the whole summer. Summer looked like forever in front of you, and now it was almost gone. She hated the thought of leaving Maple Hill so much that she even hated the boxes Mother started to pack in. But Joe whistled as he brought them down. He didn't seem to care much about anything, Marley thought. One day when she was coming downstairs, she heard Daddy say something mysterious and important. She could tell from the sound of his voice how important it was. "Well, we can't go on postponing it any longer, can we? We've got to decide now," he said. "I expect Marley would be glad," Mother said, "but I don't know about Joe. I don't even think we could get in and out," Daddy said, "but Chris says with a good load of gravel on the low place, we wouldn't have a bit of trouble. The county keeps roads clear for the school bus." Marley felt herself beginning to tremble because she was beginning to know what they were talking about. "Every objection I thought of, Chris figures a way out," Daddy went on. "They really do want us to stay." "Stay? Here? At Maple Hill? All winter?" Marley was listening so hard that her ears felt like donkeys on either side. Mother was clattering the skillet, and it was hard to hear every word she said. "As tight as ever, isn't it? After all, Grandma stayed here all the year round, as far back as I can remember, and before. And as Chris said, if we got the heat in, it's not the house that worries me, Dale." "I know." Marley heard the sadness in Daddy's voice. "It's not fair for the children. If it wasn't for school. Of course, I don't see anything wrong with country schools myself. The children get lots more attention than they do in those crowded city schools now. It's only that Joe was so pleased about being in such a big school, so new and everything, and he likes his crowd, and he wanted to get a horn and play in the band." Marley hardly heard past the words, country schools. She and Joe had seen the little Maple Mountain School. It looked just like a church with a funny bell tower. It even had a graveyard behind it on a low hill with the stones overgrown and tumbling. They traced interesting names on some of them, like Mehetabel and Josephus, and even gruesome verses about dying. When they looked through the dusty windows of the schoolhouse, they laughed and laughed. There were rows of pictures still pinned to the walls, birds and pussy willows and tulips that the children had colored in the spring. And there was the hugest, roundest stove they ever saw in all their lives. 6 rows of desks went from a little tiny row to a great big row. Joe said it looked like a school for the 6 bears, from the little bears to the big bears. "Imagine having to go to a school like that," he said. What was Joe going to think? She couldn't wait to tell him and find out. She crept upstairs again and into Joe's room, but he was still asleep. He looked tall when he was lying down. His especially because he spread himself every direction, and once he was spread on the mattress, he didn't move. Daddy said he slept like a stone and a log rolled together. "Joe," she said. He growled and turned over and pulled the covers nearly over his head. She sat on the edge of the bed. It'd be fun to tease him about the funny school, she thought. So she leaned down close to his ear and said, "Joe, guess what? We're not ever going back to Pittsburgh. We're going to stay right here at Maple Hill all winter long." "What?" He sat up so fast she almost fell off the edge of the bed. You'd have thought he hadn't been asleep for a week. "Yes, I just now heard Mother and Daddy talking," he said, "and it's good enough house to stay in all winter. And Mr. Chris says we can get in and out. And Mother says the school bus comes by and we get to go to that funny little old school by the graveyard." Her words came tumbling over each other, and it came to Marley as she said them that they weren't strictly true, at least not yet. But then she had never yet known something Daddy wanted not to be what Mother wanted to. And anybody could tell from the way he talked that he wanted to stay at Maple Hill. Joe looked absolutely horrified. "That school?" She could see on his face, he thought, she could see on his face the thought of the beautiful school where he would go in Pittsburgh. A solid block of buildings with rooms and a gymnasium and everything, with policemen to help all the children across the streets. "I don't believe it," he said, and got out of bed and started for the door. "Joe," Marley hurried after him. "Mother and Daddy were talking, see, and I don't think it's all settled, but Daddy—" "I knew it wasn't so," Joe said. "You always get things wrong." He stood and looked at her angrily. "I'll bet you made the whole thing up. Why, we started packing yesterday." "I heard them," she said. "Mother said she didn't see anything wrong with the country schools." "I heard her." "Honest?" "Honest. Daddy said it wouldn't be fair for us, and she said she didn't see anything wrong." "Imagine," Joe interrupted her as if he couldn't stand to hear another word. "That school. All those little kids right in the same room. Why, I wouldn't go to that school if there wasn't another school in the whole world." Why, he didn't seem able to find even the words to say how awful the whole idea was. He turned and opened the door, but Marley caught his arm. "Joe," Marley made her face go as long and solemn as she could, "I know how Mother feels. You see, Daddy's better here, isn't he?" For a minute, Joe stood looking at her. He saw his face get afraid just the way it used to get when Daddy was cross. Once Daddy even reached out and slapped Joe's face hard. And Mother hurried and took hold of Daddy's arm and said, "Don't you dare." Joe looked just the same now as he had then. "The other day when Mother and I were in the garden," Marley said, "Daddy was at the other end of the row, and Mother said, 'Isn't it wonderful how much better Daddy is at Maple Hill?' He was laughing and talking and telling stories and singing the whole time, all the time it took to pick the last of the beans and pull all those carrots and beets." While she talked, Joe walked slowly back to his bed. He lay down and pulled the covers up again. The huge movie theaters, the museums, the concerts, the science exhibits. She knew all the things Joe loved about the city. He liked the bridges and the hills and even the steel mills. He liked noise and people and policemen. He had his crowd, and they went to all kinds of places together. Cities were lots better for boys, she thought, even boys who liked to explore. "Don't you like Maple Hill, Joe?" she asked. "Not a bit?" "Sure I do." His voice sounded lost and little, deep in the covers. But his face came out. "Why, I was going to get that horn and play in the band and everything." "Joe, maybe we're not really going to stay here," she said. "You just tell Daddy how you feel. They were just saying we'd have to decide." He sat up again. "How do you mean, Marley? I thought you meant it was all settled." "They were just talking, see, and Daddy said we had to decide." He threw the covers off so hard they went all over the floor. "Well, I'm going down and find out," he said. "First you say one thing and then you say the other. If you don't know something, you just ought to shut up about it." He was on the stairs already. "I'm going down and find out," he said again. Marley heard Daddy say, "Find out what?" Oh dear, she thought. Why did she get excited and make out the things that were so when they weren't? At least not yet. She was always saying things were settled, and then sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't. She followed Joe down the stairs, wishing she hadn't said a single word. "Are we going to stay here all winter and have to go to that funny old school like Marley says?" Joe demanded. Mother turned from the stove. "Did Marley say that?" she asked. "How in the world did she get hold of that idea?" Joe turned accusingly as Marley came into the kitchen. She said, feeling her face go hot, "I heard you talk about it. I was just coming downstairs and Well, come on. Sit down, both of you," Daddy said. He looked at Mother. "Told you we'd better settle it, Lee. Well, now's the time." Poor Joe's face had the struggle on it again. He didn't look at Marley at all. If Daddy was going to say he was well here and sick somewhere else, what would there be to settle? Marley was in too big a hurry as usual, Daddy said. "We haven't decided because, after all, there are 4 of us and this is a mighty big decision." So, during breakfast and for a long time afterward, they talked it over. Daddy got an old scorecard and crossed out "them" and "us" and wrote points for staying and points for going. But this wasn't like cards at all, where the same number on each side makes people tied. Some points were more important than others, so that the 1 point Mother made, "Daddy is better at Maple Hill," would have canceled out 40 points on the other side. Everybody knew that the whole time. When Daddy wrote that one down, he looked as miserable as he could be. "Now remember, all of you, that's no more important than schools and advantages on the other side," he said. But there was so much on the Maple Hill side, it was really ridiculous, like live cheaper in the country, and the Chris's, and could live on government pension without Mother working. Marley thought of suggesting miracles for that side, but she was afraid they wouldn't know just what she meant. She wasn't sure either that she could explain. Now, I want to explain to you what a pension is, because it says here that on the positive sides for Maple Hill is could live on government pension without Mother working. Now, remember, Mr. Dale had been in the Army. He had been a soldier. And so when you have been a soldier for a number of years and you return to the States and you are no longer in the service, if you've worked for a period of time, they will pay you a percentage of your salary, and that is called a pension. But it's not everything that you would make in the Army. It's like maybe 50% of how much you would make. And so what they were saying is Mother would not have to go out and find a job to supplement the family income. They could live on what the government was going to pay Daddy as a retired soldier. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, let's keep going. By the time they voted, even Joe could see that the city didn't have a chance in the world. It was as if he could see his trumpet and his fine big school go floating away. But he was a good sport, Joe, as always. He actually voted to stay, even though his throat wobbled in the middle, and he went outside right after and disappeared down the road. She wondered if he'd cry when he was alone. She would have, but she guessed he wouldn't. Daddy stood in the kitchen door watching him go. "It's only for a year," he said. "Then I'll be ready to go back to my old job. I know it." Marley wanted to run after Joe and tell him what Daddy had said, but she decided to wait. If he should happen to cry, he wouldn't want anybody barging right into the middle of it. So she just ran down to the Chris's to tell them what their big decision was. Nobody wanted to cry about it there. Mr. Chris picked her up and tossed her around, laughing. Chrissy said, "Chris, be careful." But she laughed too. They began talking about all the marvelous things that happened in the winter on Maple Mountain, and how perfect Thanksgiving was and Christmas, and how Marley and Joe could have a horse to pull that cunning little sleigh. "Joe can paint it red like it used to be," Mr. Chris said, "and I'll get out our old sleigh bells. You folks will think you've walked right into a Christmas card." "I'll tell Joe about the sleigh," Marley said. "He feels so bad about that funny school." They both looked at her surprised. Mr. Chris's face went redder, even, than it usually looked. "Why, that's a fine school," he said. "We've got as good a school as any in this country, I can tell you. And big, too, growing all the time." Marley was puzzled at first. But then it turned out that Joe wouldn't go to the little school by the graveyard at all. He was 12, so he would go on the bus to town. "Did they have a band?" she asked eagerly. "A band? I'll tell the world they've got a band. If Joe wants to be in a band, he'll like that one all right. They march at all the football games in red and gold suits, and last year they went to a state contest and won honorable mention." Marley was so eager to tell Joe about the school and the band that she ran all the way home. But Joe wasn't there. He didn't even come back for lunch at noon. "Do you know, I wouldn't be surprised if he went to see his friend, the hermit," Daddy said. "Isn't it the oddest thing, the way Joe took to that old man?" Daddy sounded the least bit jealous, Marley thought. "Joe helps with the bees and the goats, and they're building a wonderful fence," Marley said. "I wish he'd come home and eat at least," Mother said, looking out the window and down the hill at the empty road. "There are worse things than goat cheese and honey," Daddy said. "Chris says Harry bakes the best rye bread he ever ate." When the dishes were done, Marley slipped away and walked to Harry's place. Clear from the second turn, she could see that Joe was there. He and Harry were building a little fence of sharp poles clear around the house, weaving it together with willow bows that crissed and crossed and wound together. Now remember, the bows are the limbs of the tree, but if they're going to weave them together, they can't be stiff. They have to be very pliable and soft. Joe had told Marley about that fence. It was just like the kind the Mexican Indians made, he said, only they made theirs out of cactus that went right on blooming with bright red flowers. Harry said his fence would take root in places, maybe, and get green leaves on it in the spring. Joe saw her coming, and before she could say a word about the school or the band or anything, he was shouting news of his own. "Marley, guess what? I'm going to take 2 goats home for the winter." "Joe, why, Mother won't. Why won't she let me?" he interrupted angrily. If we're going to live in the country, we got to figure out how to manage. Harry's showing me how to milk and separate and make butter and cheese and everything. Do you think I'm tramping all the way to Chris's place for milk all winter? Harry was sitting on the ground, cutting a neat sharp end on each of the pile of fence sticks. He looked up at Marley, and his gray beard shook when he laughed. Joe is right, he said. You must have everything you need all together before the winter really begins. For you, I have something too, and Joe will make a fence like this for them to run, but much higher. It was chickens. Harry said he had too many, and they must take at least 8 home now, today. For a present, he had already prepared an old orange crate to carry them in, tied with neat rope handles at either end. For these, you will be the caretaker, Harry said to Marley. Each on a farm should care for something alive and useful. Marley had never dared look at Harry very closely for very long, but now she looked right straight at his eyes. They were very sharp and blue, but very kind and twinkling. It was the queerest thing, but Marley actually got so excited about the goats and chickens that she forgot about telling Joe what she had come to tell. She had never really seen part of Harry's place, and now Joe showed her everything. Down the ravine, west of the hill, above the spring house, Harry had built 3 wonderful little dams. They were made of large, flat stones piled close together. They were beautiful, like fine stone walls, with grass and moss growing over them. All around his house were small, square patches of things enclosed in fences to keep the rabbits out and, as Harry said, to keep the flowers and the vegetables in. In front of the door were patches of zinnias and marigolds and rhubarb. Now, we've already talked about what rhubarb is, and zinnias and marigolds are just flowers. The place where he chopped wood was nice. It was under the hugest oak tree Marley had even seen in all her life. There was a sawhorse, and there were 3 different sized wood piles. One of big pieces, one of middle-sized pieces, and one of little pieces for kindlings, all ranked perfectly. The strange yoke Harry had worn that first day was lying against the tree. He had carved it out of a smaller tree, he said, and it fitted his shoulders neatly. It was covered with nice designs. Everything possible was carved with designs, and even the stanchions where the goat put their heads in the stalls in the little barn. There was an odd little stand where they leaped to be milked, and every single goat had the name out of Shakespeare. Now, I want to talk about 3 words in this paragraph. A yoke. In the earlier picture that we saw of Harry the Hermit in Chapter 8, he had this thing that went across his back and his shoulders. And at the ends of it were buckets that were attached to it. And that is called a yoke. And a yoke helps you carry very heavy things, and it doesn't put as much strain on your back. It allows you to carry things that are heavier than a human would normally carry. The next word is a stanchion. That is, a stanchion is almost like a very thin stall, place where the goats would stand. And then the last word is Shakespeare. Shakespeare is an English poet and an author and playwright. As you get into high school, you will read Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was his name. He was very famous, still is today, and he is considered to be one of the finest Elizabethan writers of all time. And you'll learn more about him as you progress through school. So, we're coming back to where they were. We're getting Rosalind and Audrey, Joe said. Wooden chains were everywhere, from a huge one with links as round as Marley's head to a tiny one Harry was using for a bookmark in his Bible. As the sun went down, Harry took her to the head of the meadow to look through his telescope. He had it trained on the pond below where the ducks were swimming. The trained is just pointed. Okay? Any day now the black ducks come, he said, and the mallards. Then we will have good meat. The mallards are the ducks that have the green rings around their necks. And those really are the ones that you want to shoot on a duck hunt because they have the best taste. He could turn the glass on the meadow too and watch pheasants coming and going. Pheasants, another type of bird. Marty could hardly tear her eyes away. Looking through that long tube at a pheasant made you feel as if you were taking a walk with them. She could see his white collar and the white tufts of his ears and the sun shining on him as it went lower and lower, showed dozens of colors clear down to the tip of his long pointed tail. Harry smiled when she drew back at last, sighing. Sometimes you can imagine people ask me if I'm lonely here, he said. It did seem a very silly question. He had 6 goats and 5 hives of bees and a flock of chickens and a herd of geese and a pair of cardinals that stayed near his house the whole year round. He had rabbits that came to eat from his hands and deer that walked down to drink at his dams every morning and never ran off when he talked to them. He had woodchucks and a coon and squirrels and chipmunks. He had an owl in his barn who talked to him at night and a pair of swallows. He had pheasants and grouse and the ducks down on the pond and fishes behind all his dams and peepers and frogs, not to mention spiders having thousands of babies in his windows. He showed her one spider with 4 sacks of eggs swinging right over his table where he could watch her while he ate. Then, if you considered moths and butterflies and beetles and lizards and efts, Joe said. And the sparrows are always here, Harry said, and snakes, said Joe, just because he knew Marley was scared of them. But then he added quickly, Marley, wait until you know the goats. You'll agree they're the best. It was true, as he said, that every face of every goat was different as people. Each one was sure to look straight into your eyes, though, so they were alike about being curious. There were 3 little half-grown goats, and it was nice and comical to see how much they loved Harry. They tried to get close to him for rubbing when he went into the barn, and stretched and bleated for a little touch on the nose. When he let them out, they leaped and ran and climbed onto every bump in the meadow, gazing around from every little height as if they owned the world. Now, that's something that you need to know about goats, is they love to climb. If you can ever remember going to a petting zoo where they had goats, you may have seen rocks, you may have seen hay, you may have seen even little goat houses, little houses where the goats can go into, and they will get on top of them. They will get on top of them because they like to be tall. They like to be high and looking out over their entire world. Do you know, Marley, Harry lived in the city for 50 years, Joe asked. This morning when I came over, he told me. Harry heard. It was because of Mr. Chris I stayed here, he said. I was tired and sick of the world, and my wife had left me in disgust. I had been fighting in the war and then in the streets at home, and even in my own house. I was as sick of fighting as Joe says your father is. So one day I put my belongings into a sack, started to walk like a tramp. One morning I came along this road. I was thinking hard thoughts about all men, and I was hungry. Then suddenly I saw this man working in a field right there below where the dam is. I stopped and we began to talk together. Harry gazed down toward the pond and over the green valley with fields of cabbages, blue in squares and meadows going brown here and there. First thing I thought, Harry said, was, this man looks like a tree. He seemed to stand with his legs planted in the ground. That just what I thought, Marley said in triumph. Such things happen in the old stories, Harry said, laughing. Maybe he really is a tree. I asked whether he needed help with any of his work, for I needed to earn my supper. So I stayed that night. And it turned out that he needed help all winter long. His hired man had gone away. After a year, he gave me this house to live in, and I've bought this little piece of the mountain around it. Did everything good go back somehow to Mr. Chris? Marley wondered. He had found the first pair of goats for Harry and had provided the first chickens. He never told us a word about doing that for you, Marley said. When you have done a great many good things, you forget to speak of them, Harry said. It is those who do very little who must talk of it. He still stood gazing down toward the road, toward Mr. Chris's fine big house. I became too old to be of much help on his place, he said, but I wanted to stay here and live, so I sent for my books and my knives. Soon it will be 20 years I have lived here on this same hill. It is exactly as the great Thoreau said, why should I explore the world when there is so much to explore between that road and my own doorstep? Thoreau is another great philosopher, ancient, very well known. You might not read works of Thoreau in high school, but some of you who do decide to go into college will read the works of Thoreau. We had to read them in college. It was a strange procession that went along the road at sunset. Harry drove the 2 goats on whose necks he had hung garlands of goldenrod and wild aster to make it a royal procession. Both goats and the hermit himself carried loads of fence sticks for Joe to build his chicken run. Joe and Marley carried the crates of chickens between them, trying not to jar them too much from one side to another. Even so, they squawked the whole way, poking their heads out of the cracks to complain. Whatever will Mother think, and Daddy? Just as Marley expected, they came out of the house when they heard the procession coming. There they stood, gazing down the hill. It was not until then that Marley remembered about the band and the school. Joe, Mr. Chris says I go to the little school, but you don't. You go to town, to a great big school where they have a huge band that wears gold and red and wins prizes and marches in parades. He hardly seemed to hear. He was beaming as Harry drove his Rosalind and Audrey into the dooryard. Harry's going to make a speech, he said. And Harry did. He stood with his wrinkled old hat held in front of him like a man presenting flowers to a great lady. My father used to tell me that in his country, when there were neighbors come to remain, he said, milk was brought for their supper and eggs for their breakfast. Now that you have made this great decision to stay at Maple Hill, we have brought gifts to show that we are glad. Mother was too amazed to speak. Daddy didn't manage anything but well, which wasn't much of a speech, but the goats began to bleat happily, and the chickens talked all together. Do you want to see me milk? Joe asked. Actually, Joe could make milk come spurting into the bucket. Mother looked at Daddy, and Marley could practically read her mind. Do you think if we stay in the country, Joe is going to have many of these queer friends? But Daddy could hardly keep his eyes off Joe. Mr. Harry, he said suddenly, do you think you could stay for supper? Joe was awfully pleased, but Marley couldn't help being rather glad when Harry said he had to hurry home to milk his goats and feed his chickens and geese, because Mother really looked a little sick. Joe noticed too. When Harry had gone, he said to Mother, you just wait until you know him, Mother. He's the most wonderful man in the world. Next to Mr. Chris, Marley said. She and Joe had the thought at the same minute and said right together, "Next to Daddy." Then they linked their little fingers the way you do when you've said something both together and made wishes. The wishes have to be secret, but Marley knew from Joe's look that his was about the big decision. And so was hers.